35 years ago, Francis Fukuyama declared in The End of History that the contest of ideologies was over. Liberal capitalist democratic systems had won and would be the global standard for the next millennia. But is this really working out? Here to help with this question is Dr. William I. Robinson, professor of sociology at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and the author of Epochal Crisis, The Exhaustion of Global Capitalism. William, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me on.
Thank you very much for coming online and for writing this book, for giving also analysis, and you've been doing also presentations about it. Can we maybe start a little bit with this, like capitalism and the liberal democratic system? Where are we 30 years after Fukuyama?
Right. Well, two things. Of course, Fukuyama, notwithstanding what Fukuyama said, history never ends. And it doesn't end in two senses. He acknowledged that events will still take place, but that there's no further development of human society. It's the end of ideologies and so forth. So history does not end in the sense that there is permanently qualitative transformations and fundamental developments that transform human society. But where are we 30 some odd years later? Global capitalism is in a complete crisis. Everything is crumbling. Global capitalism is in a structural crisis of overaccumulation. I'm sure we'll get into that in the interview. It's in a complete political crisis of state legitimacy, of capitalist hegemony, and of the interstate system. For me, the January 3 attack on Venezuela and the unfolding of those events is the definitive collapse of the post-World War II international order. So we have the tremendous political and geopolitical crisis worldwide, and it's intensifying by the day. We have a global social crisis, what I call a crisis of global social reproduction. The capitalist system is being restructured and transformed into such a way that billions of people cannot survive in this system, are made redundant, superfluous, and this is generating social conflict, civic uprisings, political crises in every corner of the world. And of course, we have the ecological crisis. The biosphere is facing collapse, and that's getting worse and worse. And we are already feeling the effects. There's already hundreds of millions of refugees, not just from climate catastrophes, but from all the social and political impacts, that all combine with the collapse of the biosphere we're facing. If we look 10, 15, 20 years into the future with things going as they are now, we're going to have a collapse of agriculture in the global breadbaskets. I mean, so the idea that we've had an end of history and liberal capitalism is now smooth sailing, moving forward, humanity moving forward is could not be, is utterly proven wrong where we are right now. And, I'll add one other thing. I think where Fukuyama, was where he was a bit right, or there's some kernel of truth to what he said. It's the end of the old ideologies, right? So the 20th century ideologies, the dominant ideologies, 20th century liberalism is gone, it's collapsed. And then the end of the old 20th century socialist and communist ideologies they have no real relevance outside of people's minds or people's speeches in the actual real world. So we are in a moment of global crisis, but we're in a moment of ideological reorientation and a kind of an ideological wilderness.
One of the things that really defined the 20th century, I would say, was that we did have this contest of theoretical ideologies, right? Marxism, communism, they had a large theoretical underpinning, and I see behind you, I'm not sure if we will see it in the final version, but behind you there's a picture of Karl Marx, of course, right? And on the left-hand side, I hope it will be visible. But these on liberal internationalism, they had their thinkers, the economists, right? They had their thinkers, and we have others like Ricardo and so on, and that had different schools of thought behind them, and that seems to be kind of out, but we are not over and beyond what I would call belief in how the world is or should work. I rather wonder whether we are now transitioning back away from rational explanations of how social systems work into religious or quasi-religious beliefs of how things must be. The democracy must be defended, although we don't define anymore what we mean with democracy. Security needs to be given, although we never define what security actually means. So, like, do you see any kind of connection between like the end of idea of like academically underpinned ideology and this transition into very, very strong models, frameworks of seeing the world?
Yes. Well, I think in times of acute crisis, like we are experiencing right now worldwide, masses of people, hundreds of millions, billions of people, are facing intense insecurity, uncertain future, the destabilization of our established understanding of the world and of the institutions through which we exist. And so, in times like this, people are one very susceptible to new political ideological messages, such as neo-fascism, 21st century neo-fascism here in the United States. Trumpism, the ultra right is basically sweeping many countries, and then what was a vibrant left in the 20th century and the failure of socialist and communist experiments in the 20th century has also left what remains of an organized institutional left in a very dogmatic position as well. So I think that is what's going on in times of crisis and mass insecurity. People try and grasp something that can give them a sense of grounding and a sense of understanding of the world. But if they're illusions, Fascism fascism is an ideology which can not only one, it can't explain what's going on in this crisis, and secondly, it can't resolve the crisis. And the old dogmatic 20th century left cannot either, and is in many countries insignificant. I will add one a couple things here, because you started the question or put the issue out with Marx and Ricardo and so forth, the classical thinkers, which are really not 20th century, they are 18th and 19th century. But for me, and hopefully the image will stay up of Karl Marx here, what interests me with Marxism, and I am a Marxist in an intellectual sense, let me explain what I mean by that. Marxism as an ideology is not really what interests me. Marxism as a method and an instrument of analysis and critique of global capitalism is more vital than ever, because it helps us understand this crisis that global capitalism is in. And finally, you also mentioned that people say, well, we have to defend democracy. Well, increasingly, that's not true. That's not true. Trump is he's openly saying, no, I rule the world. It's my morality that decides what we'll do. So you even see the discourse of defending democracy is well, it's losing, any grounding in many of the ruling groups around the world.
Hey, very brief intermission because I was recently banned from YouTube, and although I'm back, this can happen anytime again. So please consider subscribing not only here, but to my mailing list on Substack. That's pascalotta.substack.com. The link's going to be in the description below, and now back to the video. Something that surprises me is that now what I'm believing to see is a shift even of what I thought of as liberal media houses like the New York Times, that since the Venezuela attack, basically more or less wrote about how it was possible and how it became a success, and much less about what kind of travesty this is. And maybe just before we go into Marxism, like academic Marxism, like in what sense do you think that this attack on a South American country and a regime change operation is different from the previous ones? Because over the course of the Cold War and even beyond, we've had like a lot of such interventions. I mean, one way or another, even similar ones in Panama, right? In '89. But in which way is this event different from all of those before?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's a turning point event. It's a watershed event. And you are right that the United States and other powers, for that matter, other European powers, have intervened over the centuries, intervened in Latin America. I want to say that many people are making that parallel with Panama, but that is really very mistaken for several reasons. One, who was removed was the head of the military forces in Panama. He wasn't the formal established head of state. Here you have something which is simply unprecedented. The most powerful country in the world carries out a surgical operation and simply scoops up the president. Now, the Venezuelan president was not democratic. I mean, he lost He lost elections in 2024 and Venezuela's in crisis. But you really have something unprecedented that you just scoop up the president of a country and bring him, bring him to the United States. The other thing is we've never seen a head of state in the United States saying, I am now the acting president of another country. But Trump declared, and I'm sure you saw this, many of the listeners have saw this, maybe I think it was 3 days ago or 4 days ago, he put up a post saying, I am the acting president of Venezuela. I mean, that is simply unprecedented. But the other thing is you have to see that Venezuela is taking place parallel to, as part of, other things taking place around the world that are unprecedented. The United States has said that it is going to take over the easy way or the hard way, Greenland. Right. And that may mean a military attack against another NATO power. So, so these events are really, they, for me, are signaling the collapse of the post-World War II international order that established a so-called rules-based order, where, of course, those rules were always violated by the United States, as you pointed out already, and by other countries. But nevertheless, there was some institutional organization to the world system. And all of that is collapsing. So it's not just Venezuela. It's what's going on with Greenland. It's what's going on with a rupture in, if we want to call it bourgeois democracy, we can do that. But a rupture of bourgeois democracy. We're going from capitalist democracy to fascism here in the United States. The breakdown of the rule of law internal to the United States, and so forth, and so on. So the point is that the U.S. intervention in a Latin American country is not new. You're absolutely right. But one, the nature of that intervention, and secondly, that intervention is part of a cascade of things taking place right now, which signal a fundamental watershed, and a very, very scary and dangerous one at that.
Yeah, so we have one of the problems that I'm facing at the moment is that there's just so many individual things going on that are all that I very much, I mean, we all feel they are very much interconnected and interlinked, but they are such a chain of events now, not just a chain, but like several chains happening parallelly to each other. I mean, we still have an ongoing genocide in Gaza, despite a peace agreement and whatnot, and a UN resolution on it from the Security Council. The Israel still keeps killing people in Gaza and has demolished over 2,000 houses since the peace not agreement, but since the ceasefire. We have the UN rapporteur for the Palestinian cause. Sorry, I butchered her title, but Francesca Albanese. She is sanctioned by the United Nations, by the United States. The United States sanctions the International Criminal Court. At the same time, the International Criminal Court has also out an arrest warrant for Vladimir Putin, which the United States applauded. We have the European Union sanctioning analysts and journalists inside Europe. In the UK, we have it's now forbidden to basically protest in favor of a protest group for Palestinian rights. The people are being arrested. In the United States, you have ICE cracking down on immigrants, but just as well on US citizens. They basically roam free, and we talked before, it very much resembles already a paramilitary structure. We have Iran, we have Venezuela, we have Greenland, we have the war in Ukraine, there's so many things going on, and they are all very bad. And one thing that unites them is that they emanate from the West, or what I call the larger West.
Right. But I want to take that a step further, because you're right that in terms of actual events taking place and the agents and the actors that are undertaking those events, it emanates from the West. But I am suggesting something deeper. I am suggesting that that global capitalism is in a deep historical structural crisis, is what I termed, and you opened up the interview mentioning my new book. It's an epochal crisis. And so, yes, the actual actions unfolding in front of us that you just described emanate from the West, but there's a larger world's historic structural context and explanation for this cascade of events that we can barely keep up with. And I hope we get into that. But before we do, I want to say that, when I was listing Greenland and the end of the threat to end bourgeois democracy in the United States and the attack on Venezuela, and I said so forth and so on. So you have added other elements, and we have to see all of this as a package. And although I said that this attack on Venezuela is kind of the nail that puts the what is it? The nail in the coffin, which finally seals the coffin of the post-World War II international order. It's now collapsing right before us, our eyes, literally as we speak. But it's really started to collapse, and this happened extremely quickly with the two great events that you also mentioned, the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the West's radical political, military, economic response to that invasion. Radical, not in a good way. The invasion was bad. The Western response is bad, in my view, in my analysis. And secondly, the genocide in Palestine. Those two events were the beginning of the end, and now it is the nail in the coffin of this international order. And what is so, not just the tragedy and the unbelievable crime of that ongoing genocide, which, as you pointed out, the ceasefire it's a fake ceasefire, and we've simply gone from high-intensity genocide to low-intensity genocide. But I think we really need to stress that the impunity that the genocidaires have enjoyed to date, paved the way for also what Trump is doing in Venezuela, and they do in Greenland, because the West is saying to Israel, it's fine, you did that genocide. We might do some lightweight denunciations of genocide, but go ahead, and we'll continue to give you weapons. And that opened the way for that impunity. Means that now the U.S. can do whatever it wants with utter disregard for international laws and norms. And I want to repeat, maybe not all of the listeners heard what Trump said. Trump was interviewed by the New York Times on January 6th, and they were and they pointed out, the New York Times interviewers, and you're right about what you said about the New York Times, by the way, what they're focusing on and what they don't focus on. But the people interviewing Trump said, well, are you bound by any international laws? And he said, no, none whatsoever. They said, well, what are you bound by? Where are your constraints? What are the guardrails here? And he said, my own morality, and that's it. So, that's as outrageous and dangerous and scary as that is. The precedent to that is the impunity of this genocide.
Yeah, I mean, it's utterly horrible, because we all thought, like, genocide, if it happens again, it happens the way that it happened in Rwanda, where, like, in a short period of time there's like mass slaughter, and now we realize, oh no, it happens over several years, and actually, slowing down of the genocide. I mean, there was a genocide going on already before. There was mass replacement and so on. It then sped up, and now maybe it slowed down again. But we all now realize, or not we all, unfortunately, but a lot of people realize it's the trajectory is still exactly the same. Gaza will be emptied, and next will be the West Bank, and then more parts will be annexed. Israel cannot stop, and actually, Radhika Desai, the other great Marxist scholar, made a very important point why Israel, even structurally, will not be able to stop its very much capitalist-fueled expansion. But let's go there in a moment. What do you then think of in your book, in this Epochal Crisis? How is it unfolding, and why is it still connected with capitalism?
Right. So capitalism capitalism has gone through these great crises, what I call structural crises, not cyclical crises, which are recessions and take place about every 10 years or so forth. But if we look at in the history of world capitalism, there are big structural crises which take place about every 40 to 50 years. So everyone knows about the Great Depression of the 1930s, but few people remember the Great Depression of the late 1870s to the early 1890s. And few people remember the first really recorded Great Depression of the 1830s. And after the 1930s Great Depression was the 1970s crisis. And that put us into a new world historic stage, which I term capitalist globalization, a new globalist stage of world capitalism.
So you're talking about the moment when actually Bretton Woods collapsed, right? And the gold standard was...
That's 1971, and then there's a big recession, very, very big recession in 1973, and then the Trilateral Commission is formed, and the World Economic Forum had been formed in 1971, and then other international transnational institutions and
G7.
Yeah, we move to this new transnational stage of world capitalism, right? A new, what I call a transnational capitalist class, the hegemonic fraction of capital on a world scale, new transnational institutions. But, that we can discuss. I've been theorizing, researching and writing about that for the last 35 years or so, this new stage of world capitalism. But now what you're asking, and what's so important, is that we're in a new structural crisis, which really the beginnings are the global financial collapse of 2008. And it is not resolved in the 2010. Sure, growth is resumed in the sense there's 2-3% growth in the world economy, but the underlying causes of the 2008 collapse have actually intensified every year right up until date. And it's, again, multidimensional, but the underlying cause, we have to see each of these big crises, the big 50-year crises, involved a whole wave of expansion and with a whole new set of technologies, new institutions that fuel capitalism. They build up, there's an expansion, and then they collapse. And then there's world wars and big conflicts. And then the pieces are picked up and there's a new stage of capitalism and a new round of expansion. Well, right now, we are on the brink of world war. Hopefully that won't happen, hopefully. But everything looks like we're moving towards big international conflagration. But the underlying structural element is what I want to focus on. If you give me a moment to expand on this, it's what in Marxist political economy, and that's why we need Marx as a tool of analysis, we call overaccumulation. That the what I call the transnational capitalist class, the global financial conglomerates, and so forth, they've accumulated enormous amounts of capital. Here we're talking about $15 to $20 trillion that is idle. Now, it's not idle because it's being used for speculation. It's still moving forward because there's debt-driven growth around the world. Debt is now $325 trillion. It's unsustainable. So debt cannot continue to have the global economy expand and grow. Financial speculation is reaching its limits. The AI bubble, artificial intelligence bubble, is going to burst. Maybe tomorrow, maybe in 6 months. But I think everyone really is anticipating that in 2026 that bubble will burst and it may lead to another big collapse. But what I'm getting at, let me summarize like this, is the underlying structural dimension of the crisis is this overaccumulation. Too much capital, doesn't have where to invest and expand. The pressures build up for a new round of expansion. So the U.S. invades Venezuela and tries and aggression towards more of Latin America, open up space for a new round of expansion. Everything, Israel is committing this genocide, but it's also opening up space for financial and other and tech expansion in the whole Middle East through the aggression of the Israeli state. But here's the thing. Earlier waves of expansion, first we survived world wars with tens of millions of losses. We survive them and capital expands again. But now it's running up against what we can call tipping points or limits, and specifically the social and the biospheric limits to a new round of expansion, first of all. And secondly, the global arsenal is so nightmarish. The means of just violence and destruction so nightmarish that we will not make it through, or it's hard to imagine how we'll make it through a new round of collapse and global conflagration. And so we are in an epochal crisis with really no historic parallel. And I mean, I know that is a lot to say. I'm throwing out a lot theoretically, historically, politically. But of course, that's thresh it all out in my book.
Yeah, no, I mean, one of the cores, and Radical, I talked about this with me on this channel as well, one of the cores of this analysis is just the realization, once you have so much capital that has nowhere to go, the structural push is toward actually creating that space. And one of the way of creating that is through mass war. I mean, we see it exemplary with the genocide in Gaza, how people, while they genocide people incarcerated in a concentration camp, while they exterminate them, they're talking about rebuilding the extermination camp, right? And then making it a Riviera in the Mediterranean, beautiful, a lot of houses, a lot of investment opportunity, and then tourism will come and flourish, and it's going to be a great return on investment. I mean, that type of thinking and that then underlines also the incentive for the capitalists to say, like, okay, so first more money into the weapons to destroy this stuff, and then more money into the reconstruction, and we make a big benefit out of both.
Yes. You are raising an absolutely crucial point, and I've also expanded tremendously on that analysis. You're hitting the nail on the head. At times of chronic stagnation, overaccumulation, this urgent pressure that the system has to expand, systems of global warfare, transnational social control and repression become enormously important outlets to unload overaccumulated surplus capital. And just as you said, you cannot have a better example than the genocide in Palestine. And we can take it a step further. It's not just the rebuilding. Yeah, you have to turn Gaza now into just what you said, beachfront real estate and oil and gas that's in Gaza and so forth. But let's take it a couple steps further. First of all, it's not just that. During that 2 years of high-intensity genocide, Israel issued war bonds. They didn't call it war bonds. I forgot what they called it, but it's basically equivalent of war bonds. We'll give you a bond for the future, and you give us this money, and we're going to use it for the genocide. And I don't have the figure in front of me. I've written about it elsewhere, but it was something like billions, in the billions and billions of dollars. And so the whole global transnational capitalist class makes massive profit out of that genocide. Morgan Stanley, was it Stanley? Morgan Stanley, yeah. They made a statement on the first couple months of that genocide back in late 2023. And they looked at it because they have all this investments in the tech corporations and the military industrial corporations. And they said, the CEO of, or the one of the high level financial officials of Morgan Stanley said, oh, this is great for our portfolio, just what we needed at a time when we weren't sure where else we were going to invest, meaning investing in that genocide. But now let's look at what's going on in the U.S. The budget for so-called immigrant enforcement went from about 30 billion to 170 billion. That's what, over 500%, almost 600% increase. And where is that 170 billion going? Is fueling an unloading of overaccumulated surplus capital. And I'm sure many of your listeners do not know, many do and many do not know, that all of the concentration camps, which are called immigrant detention centers, they're almost 100% run by private for-profit corporations, including Geo Group, including Core Civic, and all of the.
Are you serious? I didn't know. Are you serious? These are private, like the private prisons in the U.S. These are for-profit corporation prisons.
For-profit corporations, and the two big ones are Geo Group and Core Civic, and nearly 100% of these concentration camps, and they're being duplicated and triplicated all over the country. The one that you may have heard of is Alligator Alcatraz, which the Amnesty International, which is in Florida, and Amnesty International released a report and said this is such unbelievably gross human rights violations. Immigrants whose only crime is that they don't have papers to be, legally in the United States, are being treated like, they didn't use that language, but like people in Nazi concentration camps. I mean, they did use language extremely strong because there's torture going on. It's unbelievable. And that Alligator Alcatraz in Florida is a private for-profit prison run by Geo Group. You and I, if we have the resources, can invest in those corporations. And if we invest in those corporations, it means we're going to make profit to the extent that the war against immigrants escalates. And then we're going to support anti-immigrant ideologies and fascist ideologies to legitimate all of that.
This brings us to a very good and important point. I mean, a very crucial point, I believe, which is this. On the one hand, capitalism, the idea that the economy and politics have to stay separate was always a really, really dumb smokescreen of
Right.
the Milton Friedmans and so on of the world. But there was always this very, very, very deep connection. Naturally, no capitalist system can run without a capitalist politics in the background. But what we had in fascism was really vertical integration of the state and the private economy. And there was one more important thing. Wait, what was it? What was it? What was it that we were getting at now? That I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought.
So what that leads to, anyway, what you've said so far segues into something else. That what we're seeing now is that the state, which is supposed to be the realm of the political and separate from the economic, and we know, as you're pointing out, it never was, never, and is not now. The role of the state, particularly the U.S. state and the Western states, but your states in general right now, is to take a sledgehammer of repression and warfare to smash open opportunities on the economic side. So it's never been more clear, the relationship between the state or the political and it's doing the bidding of the economic and transnational capital at this time in the form of warfare and intervention in Venezuela, in the form of war against immigrants, in the form also of other things such as reorganizing public finance, take money away from the United States, from medical and health, and put it into subsidies for big tech, for instance, and so the whole reorganization of public finance and fiscal policy in which the state is creating opportunities to sustain accumulation in the face of this chronic stagnation. And one other thing here, look, excuse me, Pascal, let me just remind listeners and viewers also, when Trump took office. He was inaugurated inside the Capitol building. He didn't want to go out in the cold, and I think he feared that there would not be a giant crowd for his inauguration. So they moved it inside the Capitol building. We're talking about January 20 of last year, 2025. And some of your viewers may remember that behind him, as he took the oath with his hand raised and the Bible, behind him were all of the leaders of the giant tech corporations, right? Literally, physically behind him. And that was extremely symbolic, because that is the transnational capitalist class saying, this is our new political instrument. Trumpism is our political instrument to achieve our aims at this point. And the fact that their tech is so important, because capitalist globalization is now moving in this capitalism is moving into this digital age in which the giant tech capital and digitalization drives the entire transformation and restructuring of the system underway right now. And that tech capital is at the very core right now of global power and global influence over states as well.
This is, we both of us, we are talking very quickly, just because a lot of thoughts are coming to mind that are so connected. But what this all points to is then this shift. And this is a shift that is extremely difficult for people in my profession of international relations to follow, because most IR theories start with the state. They start with the idea that nation states do what's good for nation states. At least that's like the doctrine of the realist school of international relations, which has dominated the 20th century. And they then look at things that are happening now, and people like John Mearsheimer and so on constantly have to repeat, this makes no sense. This is crazy. This is out. What they mean is that realist theory is not able to explain anymore these kind of movements, because they make no sense under the framework that Donald Trump is supposed to do what's best for the US, and the Ursula von der Leyen for the EU, Friedrich Merz for Germany. They don't behave like that anymore. This is not working out. We have a shift of capital from social into the military industrial complex, and actually people have warned of this, like US President Eisenhower has said this is a great threat. We are now way beyond that. The threat has all come real. The military industrial think tank and whatnot complex is extremely powerful. Capital is influencing all of the decisions that are taken, all of them, including, of course, Zionist decisions and so on, and capital going into bombs instead of housing. So it's like also a crisis of our framework of how we thought international politics works.
Yes. I could not only could I not agree more, but I've been arguing this for the last 2.5 to 3 decades, that we need to move beyond what I've critiqued as nation-state centrism. I'm very familiar with realism and neo-realist theory. I'm a sociologist, but deeply immersed in my own training in IR theory. And realism and neo-realism helped us understand to a great extent the 20th century, but that was an earlier phase of world capitalism. We've moved to this transnational phase where our points of reference, our theories that help us understand, are outdated, and we cling on to them. Maybe not you and me, but both intellectuals and pundits and the left clings on to these outdated theoretical understandings. So we have to update. We have to see. I mean, if anyone believes in dialectics, we know that the only thing permanent in the universe is change itself. Everything is in a process of transformation. So capitalism isn't static. There was 16th and 17th century mercantile capitalism, and with a different relationship to the state. There weren't even many nation states, right? They weren't even yet created around the world. And then we moved from there to classical competitive industrial capitalism. We moved on to the 20th century monopoly capitalism, whatever you want to call it. And realism, developed in the 20th century, was a very good theoretical framework and analytical instrument to understand the dynamics of that historical stage of capitalism. But we move into this transnational phase, and we need to update our frameworks. I want to add one other thing. You pointed out that Eisenhower famously said, as he left office in late 1960 or beginning of 1961, right? He said we have to be aware of the the danger of the military-industrial complex and its undue influence. Well, Biden said something similar when he left office in January just this past year, 2025. Because Biden is a sponsor of genocide and because of the total disaster that he represented, no one paid attention to his actual words, and he really doesn't deserve so much credit. But he said something very similar. He sat in the Oval Office, his last address, and he said, now we have to beware of the undue influence and the dangers of the tech industrial complex, of the power of the technology corporations. And so we are seeing the old military industrial complex, but it is fusing with tech capital and with transnational finance capital. And these three are coming together. They're coming together as what I can consider a hegemonic block of capital on the world stage at a planetary scale with tremendous influence over states. And so you cannot understand the action of states simply as defending their own nation-state interests.
Yeah, it's quite interesting. The last couple of years, I would say that I and a couple of others, we have argued that we are done with globalization. At least, the reassertion of the state, the reassertion of state boundaries and state power. And while that on the one hand was happening, on the other hand, we have still very, very strong transnational currents, and that's these capitalist currents that maybe they stop at the limits of the great powers. You know how the Chinese seriously differently organize their entire society, and tech capitalism is not able to rule. It is actually the political rulers in Beijing, and they sometimes even crack down drastically, right? In Russia, I'm not quite sure, but we certainly know that otherwise, the transnational capital has huge influences and accumulates and has baked in structural influence through legal processes like lobbying in the United States, lobbying in the EU, financing, campaign financing, and so on, right? So where does this, is it just the Western system that is collapsing, or is it actually the world system? Like, because, sometimes we really make the mistake to think that we are the world, but actually there's a whole part outside of the way that this system works.
Yes. So let's look at this. I mean, it's a great question or debate that you're putting on the table here, and it's absolutely urgent. But let's start with globalization. It depends on what we mean by globalization. There's the mainstream globalization. The world is becoming integrated and unified. Some even spoke about harmonious global village. I mean, all of that was a lot of what the term used back then to critique that was globaloney. And I share the critique of that conception of globalization, and that conception is dead. It's not just dying. It's dead. But that was never my understanding of globalization. My understanding of globalization is that capital expanded in a new transnational way, in new transnational ways, and levels of integration through the new communications technology and so forth brought about a new type of organic connection, organic integration of what were national economies into what we still have in place. It hasn't been and it's not going to be dismantled. A globally integrated system of production, finance, and services, regardless of what China does. Yeah, China has some capital controls, but put that aside for a minute. Russia's been kicked out by the West, but that's the state that kicked Russia out of the global economy. It's not capital. Capital didn't want that to happen. Transnational capital doesn't agree with that. They want to be able to invest in Russia. Russian capitalists want to be able to invest in the West. So it's states trying to gain some influence here to dismantle this globalized system of production, finance, and services, but they can't. And so still everything we consume in the United States, with or without tariffs, is made by a whole globally integrated economy. And let's turn to China for a minute. You're right what you're pointing out, that the relationship between state and transnational capital in China is different in the West. It's a very different model. It's, for me, a state capitalist model with a very strong state with a political control over transnational capital. But we need to be clear that what they're controlling is not Chinese capital, it's transnational capital, because the giant Chinese corporations, which are both state and private capital coming together, operate all around the world and also co-invest with Western transnational capital. We used to study the structure of capital at the nation-state level. When we get to the age of globalization, the Marxists, and not just the Marxists, but the radical structuralist thinkers and so forth, forget that you have to continue analyzing the structure of capital. And when we do that, we see this incredible transnational global integration of capitals, whether it's Chinese Russian capital, again, pushed out, but that's because states did it, right? But there's incredible integration. So my area specialty is Latin America. And when we studied Latin America, Chinese transnational capital is so thoroughly invested throughout Latin America, and really China could not exist without full integration into the Western Hemispheric political economy. So you really can't talk about like China, this is just the West when we talk about globalized capitalism. And also the crisis is global because the US collapses now. And I really, before we run out of time, I really want to say something about the petrodollar and Venezuela because it's linked to all of this. But if the US has a collapse, a financial collapse starting here, it is going to rumble all over the world. There's not going to be a zero effect in China in the Asian geoeconomic Asian-based economy. There's not going to be in Europe insulation from that. It's going to have global ramifications because of this level of integration, objective integration, irrespective of what states want. I don't know if you'd like me to say something about petrodollars, but I think it's part of a critical story here.
I mean, the petrodollar as a concept, luckily over the last couple of years, has become more of a talking point, and has been better understood of how it underpinned, especially how it underpinned the post 1945 U.S. Capitalist system. But the changes now that are going on are quite dramatic. So, and some people say like, okay, this is the end of the end of the petrodollar, and therefore the end of U.S. dollar hegemony. And other sectors are saying, no, it's just transforming. Where are you?
Right. So yes, it's not the end yet, but it's moving towards the end of the petrodollar. But that doesn't mean the end of global capitalism and an integrated global capitalism. That's the confusion. So let's look at this for a moment. Yes, 1945, but really the other major turning points, there were two other turning points. 1971, as we discussed earlier, the U.S. goes off the gold standard. 1974, with the OPEC, the oil embargo and all of that, and then the recession, the very significant recession of 73, 74. Saudi Arabia and the United States signed the petrodollar agreement, and Saudi Arabia agrees the emerging global oil market will be traded in dollars. And so that allows the United States, one, that all marketing, the global oil market will be dominated in dollars, but it's more than just that. It also means that the dollar is going to be the global reserve currency, the currency of the global trading system. What that allows the United States to do is to have deficit financing. You can just print dollars and you can spend all of this money simply by printing dollars because it's recognized as the global currency. And it also means that because that's the case, investors from all over the world, as we move toward the stage of globalization, the late 20th century and on that I'm analyzing, or they all are going to buy bonds, U.S. dollar bonds, from the Treasury Department and hold all of those bonds. That will allow the United States to keep its internal economy floating and growing still and sustaining itself. And now, starting with the BRICS and with Venezuela was starting to trade its oil not in dollars, but in other currencies, including yuan. And the other BRICS countries are starting to say, well, we're not going to exclusively trade oil and other things in just dollars. So that it doesn't threaten transnational capital. That's what I have to stress. Transnational capital moves around the world in many different ways. It threatens the power of the U.S. state, the state elite, and it threatens something else. If there's a collapse of the petrodollar, then that means the U.S. state cannot sustain high levels of living standards in the United States. There will be a plummeting of living standards. There will be hyperinflation, right, if it collapses, the petrodollar arrangement. And there will be mass social and political conflict, right? And so in part, because Trump said it, we forget, Trump says when a few weeks into his tenure, he said, we need Greenland. Everyone laughed. We're stupid. Now they're taking it seriously. So he throws things out, and months later, it hits the actual political scene. So months ago, Trump said, I'm warning every oil exporter in the world, do not dare start trading your oil which is not in dollars. No one paid any attention. Now the attack on Venezuela, saying to the whole world, and we're taking over the oil and it's going to be in dollars. So there's an attempt by the U.S. state to defend the petrodollar, right? And that's also a key part of the story, but it's not defendable. It's not defendable because the actual reality of global economic decentralization and competing systems of centers of political power and geoeconomic power, it's not defendable. And so that's why I'm saying the whole international order, the international political economy, not global, right? These relations and the whole international order is collapsing before our very eyes.
Yeah, and I liked what you said a while ago. You said like we had the beginning at the beginning of the end of the system we were in. Now we're in the middle of the end. I more or less, right? We are further down the end. Um, when what's going to be the end of the end? I mean, is it going to get worse? I mean, it's probably going to get worse. And or like let me put it this way: if we avoid a third world war with nuclear exchange and billions of dead, and I just had a discussion yesterday of what that would mean. It's we are talking about an extinction level event. If we avoid that, like let's put that aside because that's the end of the end, like the terminal end. But let's say an end that has a next phase. What would that be?
Right. Sure. But so let's say we're able to avoid World War, and we better hope so, because none of us are going to be around to have more podcast interviews, right?
Yeah.
You already said that. But short of that, we're still headed towards a financial collapse, because and it may be that is always a trigger to these big financial crises, right? The trigger may be the bursting of the AI bubble. That's the most likely scenario. But there's still going to be that. And then that's going to have its political ramifications. States and governments will fall. There will be more civil conflict. Hopefully, I mean, the best case scenario for us here in the US and for the world is that if there is a financial collapse in 5-6 months, that it generates conditions in which Trumpism is taken out of the picture somehow or neutralized. And because the biggest danger of world war right now is coming from Trumpism, that outright clear. I mean, there's no debate should be no debate about that. But let us say, hypothetically, there's a big collapse, a global depression, 5, 6, 7 years down the road, we get out of it. We could see a new round of expansion and prosperity, not for the world's poor, but prosperity in the sense that the system stabilizes and there's high levels of growth, driven by the new digital technologies. That's why earlier in the interview, I was saying that so central to this story, and there's just so much we can talk about in 1 hour, is these new digital technologies, because they're more than just introducing like a new phase for industrial production or something. They are radically transforming the nature of even beyond the nature of capitalism, but even beyond the nature of capitalism, the nature of human social relations and social structures and institutions and our consciousness. I mean, it's a revolution in the forces of production, and it's going to bring about changes in the relations of production. I mean, we don't have time to all talk about digitalization, but very specifically in response to your question, if we manage to survive, to weather a political and an economic transition away from this crisis we're in right now, we may see a period of renewed capitalist consolidation worldwide, global capitalist consolidation and prosperity, but it will only last at the maximum a few decades, because there's another contradiction we haven't spoken about, and that's the biosphere contradiction, the ecological crisis. And what that will lead to, not 2030, not 2035, but mid-century, that's going to lead to, as I said earlier in the interview, the collapse of agriculture, unless there are radical changes now, which are possible. It's not a doomsday scenario. Those changes are possible. But the collapse of agriculture. Now, there are 1/3, I think it was the UK government issued a report 5-6 years ago saying 1/3 of the areas currently inhabited by hundreds of millions of people are going to be uninhabitable. Humans cannot inhabit them because they're too hot. 120, well, Fahrenheit. You guys use the Celsius, so 45, 47, 50 degrees and higher. Whole regions of the world will be uninhabitable. So you're going to have hundreds of millions of people moving about. Then you're going to have, a global police state, because the ruling classes have to deal with hundreds of millions, even billions of climate refugees. So, but that's talking about mid-century. I do not see, that's why I say Epochal Crisis, the exhaustion of global capitalism. In the second half of this century, I will be gone. I'm too old. You may still be around. You look a lot younger than me, but it's not going to look pretty. There can still be a lot of radical changes right now that avoid that. But I don't see global capitalism surviving through the second half of this 21st century. But in answer to your question again, for the next few years, there may be a revival, a regeneration of globalized capitalism through these digital technologies, but there'd have to be political changes, not fascism, not the type of political systems we see now. Right. More of radical reformist capitalists taking control of the state, like a New Deal for the 21st century, with the Green New Deal and things like that.
Would you say that actually that, the New Deal by Roosevelt, but also in Europe, when we've seen in the last century countries that went for a couple of decades, I would just say the social democratic route, meaning you still have a capitalist system, but there are very strict boundaries, and the state is more or less on top, and actually redistribution is mandated. Is that, in your view, a viable way to constrain these forces of doom that then eat away on their own like fundament of success,
Yes.
or like in the Marxist or in the ideological Marxist idea that everybody has to transition to communism in order to survive? Like, which one do you see is most viable as a realistic approach towards structuring society?
Right. So yeah. So I mean, so I would like to see a global democratic socialism, but I don't think that's going to happen in the next few years. Rather, what could happen to buy us time, and save humanity from this imminent, disasters, is exactly what you're referring to. We can call it a global New Deal, or I call it a global reformist Keynesian project, right? You can't have Keynesian as a nation state level anymore. With globalization, that's not possible, and that's been demonstrated, and still demonstrated as we speak. But there are elements of the transnational elite that, and specifically look at the World Economic Forum, right? I mean, everyone comes together there, but the thought process in those elites clustered around the World Economic Forum is this wing of the transnational elite, which is reformist. And what are they calling for, or they have been calling for in the last few years, starting in 2010s, are two things. Regulating the global market, so introduce an element of regulation, but now at the global level, not the nation state level. And secondly, redistribution downward. So those two elements, or regulation of the global market, the global economy, and redistribution at a transnational level, may buy the system time. It may stabilize with the new technologies being its substrate or technological substrate, and will buy humanity time to move beyond capitalism. Because again, even if those transnational radically reformist elites come to power in country after country, they're still not going to be able to resolve the contradiction between capital and nature, right? Because capital still has to endlessly expand and accumulate. It still has to devour nature. And so that, again, the best case scenario, 2026 to 2050, we have radical reformist projects within global capitalism. And from there, we can figure out how to move beyond global capitalism. I mean, I'd like to today, but that's not going to happen.
No, but I mean, one of the jobs that academics have is to chart out possible futures, right? And maybe also pinpoint at the places where realistic change could be implemented. So that's not to say that it will happen, right? That's just part of the also final stage of the analytical process, I would say. William, this was really, really interesting. I very much appreciate your framework and the way that you've tried to explain this. We talked very fast. Everybody listening, I'm sorry. I hope you noticed that in YouTube you can actually slow down conversations as much as speed them up. William, people who want to find your writings, your books, or your ongoing projects, where should they go and find you?
The best way would be my University of California webpage. So I think it's too much to spell it out here, but it's so simple. I'm at the University of California in Santa Barbara, because we have 12 campuses or something. So you go to the University of California, Santa Barbara, you go into the Sociology department section, and you go to faculty, and then you'll see me listed. When you click on me listed, there's a link to my professional website. I have my books, a lot of articles published up there. That's the best way.
Okay. I will try to find the link and put it into the description box below. William I. Robinson, thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you so much for having me on.